And welcome to another edition of Gridiron Nation on TSN. He is Gord in Studioville. I'm Jim on Football Island. Coming off a weekend where there were 5 national championships or regional championships in Canada. We won't tell you about that now, but we will tell you about the Stateside 5. In at number 5 for the first time in the Stateside 5 this year, it is Ali Saad of Bowling Green, who goes to 5-0 with a win over Central Michigan. He had 6 tackles and 2 TFL. For UNLV, it is Jet Elad, the strong safety, with 5 solo tackles and a pass breakup and a 2-point win over Hawaii. UNLV now at 7-2. Even though it was a loss, it was won to undefeated Army, and Jalen Smith did his job. 10 tackles and 4 solos in that 14-3 decision. Curtis Rourke in at number 2 on the 5 this week, 17 of 28 for 206, 2 TDs and 1 INT. A great first half, struggled a bit in the second, but got a 20-15 win over Michigan. Indiana is 10-0 for their first time ever. And in at number 1, it is Daryl Jabome from Rutgers. 13 tackles, 11 of them solos. Listen to this, 3 TFLs in a 26-19 win over Minnesota. So you may notice that Curtis Rourke comes in at number 2 this week, even though Indiana is 10-0 for the very first time in that program's history. Gord, that game against Michigan, you'll really, when you look, especially at the second half, it wasn't necessarily a game that Indiana grabbed to win. It was one that maybe Michigan lost.
Yeah, I would say so. There was a lot of settling for field goals. There were a couple key penalties that Michigan took in that second half, and there was some pretty questionable clock management at the end of that game by Coach Sharon Moore as well. So I would agree with you that game was there for Michigan to win, and Indiana maybe a bit fortunate to escape that one. And in particular, I think Indiana benefited from the fact that Michigan is just, for the most part, is just completely discombobulated on offense right now. They are very dysfunctional. Unfortunately, their quarterbacks just don't look like they can get the job done at the Big Ten level. And it's too bad because it's kneecapping what is some obvious talent on that side of the ball. Donovan Edwards, the running back, has had a decorated career. He's been kind of kneecapped this year. Colston Loveland, standout tight end, has had his production go way down as well. And so I actually was telling a friend, like, it is shocking that a program like Michigan can't find a quarterback that can do enough for them to win these games more often than not. But on the Indiana side, I think that they've got a lot to go back to the drawing board on in the second half. They came out guns a-blazing, had an outstanding first quarter and a half. We'll call the first half and be charitable. But after the halftime break, and this is still a national championship caliber defense for Michigan, to be fair, but they produced a grand total of, I think it was 52 yards of offense in the second half. That is not going to get it done most weeks. And of course, they do have the week off, but their next test is going to be their biggest test. They get to go into Columbus to the Horseshoe and play Ohio State. And you better believe that Ohio State is going to give them absolutely everything they can handle. And so they're going to have to figure out how they can clean some stuff up and step it up to the next level. I think in the long term, this is probably a good thing for Indiana. They haven't really been challenged a lot this year. They have cruised most weeks. This has been the first real tight one for them. So I think that getting that under their belts and surviving it going into Ohio State might be a good thing for them long term.
9 starters on that Michigan defense were on the national championship team as starters from last year. How much of a test was that for Indiana as they get that bye week and they approach that Ohio State game? And is there a path for them against Ohio State?
Yeah, I think it was a big test for them. And in particular, that Michigan secondary is their strength. And so it really challenged Curtis Rourke. He actually looked pretty comfortable in the first half, but they started to really put the clamps on some of the stuff they were doing. And so they'll have to figure out how to get more creative because that is also a strength for Ohio State. But what I think is the biggest red flag for Indiana going into this Ohio State game, at least when they have the ball, is the amount of pressure that Michigan was able to generate up front, because that's where Michigan and Ohio State are kind of next level over the rest of the pack. Indiana has not played Penn State this year. That's the only other team in the conference that really is in that echelon. And for Ohio State, they've got some of those big elite pass rushers, the JT2 and Molas of the world, who can get to the quarterback. Indiana's going to have to figure out how they can hold up front and give Curtis Rourke that time that he needs to cook. Because we know that Curtis has a lot of virtues, but with the knee injuries he suffered in the past, he's not necessarily the most agile and escapable guy in that pocket. He's a guy that's at his best when he can sit there and he can pick apart secondaries with his outstanding deciphering skills. And so they're going to have to figure out how they can keep him clean so he can do that.
So Oregon is a cut above when we're talking about those undefeated teams. They handled Maryland this past week. We saw what Indiana did against Michigan. But, when you look at the rest of the pack, real kind of middling results. Miami loses, and Georgia Tech takes the goalpost for a walk through the campus. BYU showed up just in time to find a win against Utah and a game-winning field goal. And I'll tell you what, the North Texas defense did everything in their power to stay close with that Army team and that 14-3 loss. And there are Canadians that played roles in all of those games.
They did, and I would like to apologize to all the Miami fans out there for the signature Gord Randall curse. I go on this show and go, yeah, they've got the best chance to stay undefeated, and then sure enough, the choke comes. But so I'm gonna much like Miami, I'm gonna skip that game, and I'm gonna move on to the BYU Utah game, and yeah, it was tight. But you got to give BYU credit. That's a really difficult environment to go in and play against. Utah is having a bit of a down year right now compared to their usual standards, but that is still perennially one of the best defenses in the country. Morgan Scally, for my money, might be the best defensive coordinator in the entire nation. And so they know how to shut down excellent offenses, and the proof is in the pudding. Jake Retzlaff, the standout quarterback for BYU, completed less than 50% of his passes in this game, did not throw for a touchdown, and was sacked, I think, 4 times. So this was a really good effort from the Utah defense to hold them in it. But I got to give BYU credit because on the flip side of the ball, they managed to hold their team in it as well. And so in a game that is called the Holy War, it turns out that the Mormons ended up on the positive side of it this time around. But the other thing I want to say about this game too, like, in undefeated teams, to get through a season undefeated, you have to survive a few scares, right? And this was one of the scares. We knew this was going to be a tough game for them. It was a tight line from the outset, so Vegas knew it was going to be tough too, and they survived. So good for them. On to the next one, very similar to what we talked about with Indiana. One last thing on this game, by the way, aesthetically, a beautiful game. Both teams chose to wear their home jerseys. It was blue versus red. Canadians might have looked at it and mistaken it for Laval Montreal. It was awesome to look at. And so I want to shout out that as well, because it's one of the things I love seeing in college rivalries.
Let's go back to the Heisman watch. I don't think Rourke really helped or hurt his cause all that much, because at the end of the day, Indiana gets the win. Travis Hunter, who's also in that Heisman talk, he sat out the second half with a shoulder injury. Ashton Genty looked frustrated at times, I think, in a very lackluster overall game for Boise State, but he did get a couple of big splash plays in that game. And Cam Ward with a key fumble at a very serious time for Miami, as they were trying to hold on and find a way to win that game against Georgia Tech, to hold on to their perfect record. Couldn't do it. So who was helped, who was hurt in the Heisman race out of those top 4?
I mean, I would say that Travis Hunter still is starting to pull away a little bit, in my opinion. And it's just because we've talked about this on the show, but he just does things that other people around the country, nobody else around the country does, right? The guy has played more snaps of football this season than anybody else by about 1.5 times. So he is just doing incredible things out there. And even though he did miss a chunk of this game, he still managed to put up a touchdown receiving, almost 100 yards receiving. He locked things down defensively, and this was called back on a penalty, but made one of the most spectacular interceptions you'll ever see in this game as well. So this guy just continues to show week in, week out that he may not win the Heisman at the end of the day, but I think that it's comfortable to say at this point in time that Travis Hunter is the single best football player across the country right now. In terms of the rest of the contenders, I want to actually introduce a new name who's kind of been flying underneath the radar, but probably needs to be talked about here. And that's, you talked about Oregon earlier. That's their quarterback, Dylan Gabriel. He's had a phenomenal season, but has kind of fallen underneath the radar. I think kind of a victim of the fact that everyone kind of expected Oregon would be here. And so all of a sudden, though, he's a guy that is just week in, week out, putting up great performances. They survived the test against Ohio State. They're number one in the country right now, and oftentimes that tends to give a guy helium going through the Heisman ceremony. So it is becoming a crowded field all of a sudden, and I think that's in part because no one's really pulled away and lapped the field, but I think also because there's just a lot of really good football being played and a lot of standouts, especially on the offensive side around the country right now.
When we come back, we will recap and preview a busy time north of the border. Stick around. And welcome back to Gridiron Nation on TSN, everyone. Time to take off to the Great White North. There were 5, count them 5, I do that a few times in this show, championship games in Canada this past weekend. The Canadian Bowl was one of them, and then there were 4 conference championships. And to recap this, we brought in Tom Sterling from At the 55 podcast. Tom, good to have you along.
Thanks so much for having me on, guys.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the Canadian Bowl before we dive back into U Sports. The St. Clair Saints over the Okanagan Sun in Windsor, Ontario. I did not expect this. I did not see this coming. It had been since 1999 that a team from the OFC have won one of these things. This is important for the CJFL, I think, in terms of its potential for its growth and the way it attracts athletes to its programs. Tom, how important do you think it is that an Ontario team has finally won this thing after a quarter of a century?
I think it's hugely important to the sport and especially to Ontario football. I spent some time myself with the Burlington Braves back in the day, and it was thought of as an afterthought, certainly to the powerhouse teams that were out in the West. So to see a team from Ontario be able to take this title, especially from a program like the Okanagan Sun, is going to go so huge for everybody in Ontario who follows and plays in the CJFL.
Yeah, that's right. Like, this wasn't a cheapie, and it's worth noting the Okanagan Sun got past the Regina Thunder, who got past the Saskatoon Hilltops. So it's been nice to see some different faces near the top of this. But, you know, the Okanagan Sun looked every bit a national title type of team throughout the season. They were basically the wire-to-wire leaders in the BCFC as well. So, you know, got to give full credit to the St. Clair Saints. This was not a cheapie. Yeah, they had home field advantage, but historically that hasn't really been anywhere nearly enough to level the playing field. And in a lot of cases, when Ontario's been in this Canadian Bowl final, they've usually not been particularly close. So the fact that it was even close, I think, was a positive take out of it. And for them to actually come out on top, I mean, surprised is an understatement. I would say shocked was my reaction when I saw those scores trickling out.
Now, let's go to the conference finals from the 4 conferences across Canada. First of all, starting with the Canada Weston, the Hardy Cup. You've got a 3-5 team in Regina that goes up from Springfield, goes to Shelbyville, a.k.a. Saskatoon, and they steal their lemon tree, and they do it with a 3-5 team, Gord. But here's the thing about the Regina Rams this year. Technically, they're 4-5 going into that game because they did win a playoff game going into it. But still, they had the best defense in the Canada West, a conference that wasn't renowned for their defense this year. Should we be all that surprised?
Not necessarily, and I think it's worth noting, I don't think they lost a game by more than a score this season. So while they were a 3-5 team, it was because they came out on the wrong end of a lot of coin flip type games, more often than not, at least. And so maybe that record belied their true talent level. But I think that what really stood out for Regina is that this isn't a team that really has a superstar driving the bus. And I think that's probably a part of the reason why they flew under the radar a little bit as well, because this is just, especially on that defensive side, it's just a very solid unit across the board. Jim, you alluded to the fact that they were the best defense in the Canada West. They were the best defense in the Canada West by a fair margin in most metrics. So their national rankings, I think they were 7th in the nation in yards per game allowed, which doesn't really draw much attention. But when you look at the rest of the Canada West, they're all in the upper teens and into the 20s in terms of yards per game allowed. It is a very offensively oriented conference across the board, probably the most of the conferences in the country. So this is a legitimate defense, 3rd in the nation in rushing yards allowed, and that matched up really well for them against the Huskies. These two teams split in the regular season. It's worth noting. So it's not like Saskatchewan had the clear advantage here. These were pretty evenly matched teams, and what came to pass was that Regina did what it needed to do. It shut down Riker Frank. It forced them to throw the ball a lot, and it forced Anton Amundsen into 4 interceptions. You're not going to win a game at this level at that point in the season with 4 interceptions. Phenomenal job done by that defensive unit. And then on the other side of the ball, when they've won, this was the script. They did enough to get over the hump, and that's exactly what they did. So I'm interested to see how this lines up moving forward, because that was a pretty legitimate looking offense for the Huskies this year, and they put the clamps on them multiple times this season.
And I'm thrilled for Coach Mark McConkey of the Regina Rams as well. He's a young coach, and he is a class act in terms of leading that program. Tom, let's switch our focus to the Yates Cup, the battle of the 2 purple teams, and Laurier comes out on top. Should we be surprised at this result, especially since on the scoreboard, Laurier was so convincing?
I think the only surprising thing about this game is the amount of points that were scored. Certainly a lot of people were feeling that the Laurier Golden Hawks, this was their time to really come out, and if they were ever going to get the monkey, the proverbial monkey off their back in the purple ponies, it was going to be in this game, and that's exactly what they did. The nation's leading offense in terms of points were the Western Mustangs this year, and despite putting up 31 points, this was a defensive showcase from the Laurier Golden Hawks. Getting to Evan Hillock consistently here, sacking him 4 times and making him uncomfortable is traditionally where we've seen Western, and specifically Evan, struggle to really keep things going. But this Laurier Golden Hawk offense is one of the best I've ever seen. Taylor Elgersma rightfully getting the Yates Cup MVP and leading all of U Sports in major categories like passing yards and passing touchdowns. Finding his receivers the way that he was something outstanding. And then going into the run game as well, and Tanner Nelms being able to establish over 170 on the ground. This Laurier offensive line played some of its best football against a Western defense that had been playing some of its best football, especially after taking out the Guelph Griffins in the game before. This was such an amazing showcase of how well this Laurier team under Coach Falls and Coach Todd Galloway on the offensive side in particular has continued to grow and expand over the past 3 years and come to the pinnacle, which is being the Yates Cup champions as of this year.
Now let's go to the Loney Bowl, because we're going geographically, and you go, well, you go to the AUS and the Loney Bowl. No, this game was played in Lennoxville, Quebec, with the 8-0 Bishops Gators hosting St. Mary's. And in our show last week, we were practically crowning Bishops as a team that could potentially dominate the AUS for years to come. And they really didn't even dominate this game all that much, Gord. I'm surprised this one went to 3 OT.
To be clear, I seem to recall pumping the brakes on that talk about Bishops last week. So, yeah, you're right. While it was, I think, a resounding victory for Laurier in Ontario, it was definitely not that for Bishops this past weekend. And it was kind of an up and down game for a lot of regulation. This was kind of a dreary affair, very low scoring, not a lot of big plays going on. And then all of a sudden, with about a minute and a half left, St. Mary's gets this miraculous chip drill touchdown from about 65 yards out, and all of a sudden takes the lead. And you're going, oh my God, like they're actually going to pull this off. It's 16-13. Bishops get the ball back. They go 2 and out, and the clock is running low, but it's still in that situation where they can't just kneel it out yet in the Canadian game, right? Anything could happen in Canadian football. And sure enough, St. Mary's fumbles deep in their own end and gives Bishop the gift of a short chip shot field goal to send it to overtime. So great, phenomenal back and forth finish. We get to overtime, and overtime goes field goal, field goal, field goal, field goal, field goal, turnover on downs. So anyway, as flat of an ending and not a resounding victory by the Bishops Gators, and given the history that we've seen with the AUS, we felt like we needed to see Bishops dominate this game to really get excited about them moving forward in the Uteck Bowl. I don't think that we saw that. So, if you weren't pumping the brakes last week like I was, you might be pumping the brakes a little bit here, but I don't want to take away from the job that Coach Sheriff Nicholas and his staff have done, because this program's come a long, long way in the last couple of years. And who knows, they could still surprise in the Uteck Bowl, but they're going to be very up against it, and they're going to have to take their game up a couple of notches from what we saw this past weekend against a plucky St. Mary's squad.
But the one thing you said to me online, and I'm going to say this on the broadcast, you said, take a look at that overtime. that was an AUS game that was on brand in terms of the way that it was executed. Let's go over to the Dunsmore Cup. And the first half of that Dunsmore Cup gave me the opportunity to resurrect the term rock fight. It was 10-5 at halftime. I had the William Shatner meme up with him throwing a rock at the Gorn from a battle from a 1960s Star Trek. It was looking ugly, but you know what? At the end of the day, Tom, this was Laval's coaching staff out coaching Montreal's coaching staff.
I couldn't agree more with that statement. When you watch these teams play, and they've played a fair few times, especially in that Dunsmore Cup over the years, this is always a grind 'em out game. For the folks who follow the RSEQ throughout the years, defense is what gets you out of that conference, and that's why so many of those teams tend to win the Vanier Cups, because of those outstanding defenses. And when you have great defense, it's like you said, it turns into rock fights pretty quickly here. I was expecting this to be a little bit more of a battle between the two quarterbacks, and Jonathan Senecal, obviously the previous Heck Crichton winner, and the new RSEQ MVP in Arnaud Desjardins. And the two of them battled certainly, but the defensive showcases here were outstanding. I do want to say that Olivier Cool is potentially one of the greatest receivers, certainly in the RSEQ and up there in all of Canada. 10 catches, over 140 yards, and 1 touchdown, really showcasing why this Laval offense has been so successful throughout the year here. But that comes painstakingly at times, although it's once again showcasing how important that defense is, because Olivier Coul's lone touchdown was a completely alone in a 41-yard grab to go right into the end zone. The smallest mistakes in these games, when you have great coaching, can certainly turn the tide. Coach Glenn Constantine, obviously being a defensive coach as well, has always instilled that within his teams. But to have Arnaud Desjardins and the growth that we've seen from him, even just last year, 1 touchdown to 7 interceptions in the 3 showcases against Montreal. This year, 6 touchdowns to 1 interception. Flipping the script entirely and showcasing that in the Dunsmore Cup, and that's a big reason why the Laval Rouge et Or are your RSEQ champions.
So we've got 2 national semifinals. Let's start with the one in Regina. It is the Mitchell Bowl. It is Laval against Regina. These 2 teams actually hosting the next 2 Vanier Cup, so that's great for these 2 programs. You always know that Laval is going to be at the top of the charts, but to have Regina 1 game away from a Vanier Cup is great for building excitement for that game in that town next year. But enough about next year, Gord. What about this game? What are your thoughts?
Well, number one, I hope that there's a good turnout at this game. This is a fantastic venue. If there could be enough bodies in that venue for it to show out. You know, and Regina plays in Mosaic throughout the season, and unfortunately, it's usually a couple hundred people in the stands, and it looks like nothing. So I'm hopeful that enough people turn out that they can really do justice to what's one of the great venues in Canadian football. With regards to the actual football on the field, I'm excited to see this Regina defense match up against Laval when Laval has the ball. Arnaud Desjardins has had an outstanding season. He had that injury scare at the end of the regular season, in the first round of the playoffs, but he seemed to be fine last week, so he's back in full form, it looks like. And so I'm interested to see how things match up on that side of the ball. But where I think, unfortunately, the real separation is going to be is on the other side of the ball, because as I alluded to earlier, the character of this Regina team has been that its offense is able to find just enough points to keep up with its defense and surpass it enough times. It wins close and it loses close. That's kind of what its MO has been. But we saw last year a Canada West team go out in the Vanier Cup, play against the RSEQ champion, and get the life just absolutely sucked out of its offense. And so those memories are still running fresh for me. Now, that was Montreal, not Laval. It was UBC, not Regina. But UBC went into that game with what they thought was a pretty high-flying, explosive offense, and Montreal took the life right out of that. And Laval, historically, has had the exact same character. They're like a python. They will just slowly suck the life out of an offense. And I don't think they're going to give them any air here. So I'm really interested to see what Regina can come up with on offense. And I think ultimately that's going to make the difference in this one. It wouldn't surprise me if it's a fairly low score at the end of the day all around. But I think Laval is probably going to go in with the attitude that we will need to get to 20, and that should be enough. And it would not surprise me if that indeed comes to pass.
Tom, the one thing about Laval when it comes to these national semifinals is that they are an exception to the rule in that they have proven that they can come out west and they can win games.
Yes, when you look at a Laval squad, the biggest thing going for them is that they've been here before. This is an entire team, an entire coaching staff that is not afraid by the lights, and certainly most often than not plays in front of larger crowds at home games than they do in these national semis and even in the national championships. So having a game against a opposing team with opposing fans is never going to shake them. This is Coach Glenn Constantine. He is the single greatest coach from a win standpoint, and a lot of folks feel from an overall standpoint with the domination that we've seen from the Laval Rouge et Or since he's taken over. Having a flight to go across Western Canada is not something that shakes this team very easily. It's really going to come down to how well can this Regina defense go up against this stout Laval offense. Delaney Robinson, cornerback for the Regina Rams defense, has been playing some unbelievable football and is stout in being a lockdown corner for them. But Olivier Cool is one of the best receivers, like we just mentioned. I'm really interested to see if they're going to move Delaney to try to cover Olivier Cool wherever he goes. I think that's their best opportunity to try to shut him down at least, but it's not like Arnaud is only throwing to him.
Tom, with the Uteck Bowl, what do you think outside of the obvious, which is a win? What do you think that Mike Faulds and Laurier want to get out of this game against Bishops?
Bishops has showcased a willingness to really look after defense. They were the number one rush defense in the entire league in the regular season, only offering about 53 rush yards per game. And while when you think of this Laurier offense, you think of Taylor Elgersma, you think of those receivers, Tanner Nelms being a quiet back to look at, he's still playing some outstanding football, and that offensive line can establish the run really well. To go up against Laval or to go up against anybody else in the national championship, you need to be able to hold the ball and run the ball effectively. If you're scoring back and forth, that's great, but ultimately, if you can hold the ball and control time of possession, that's what's going to put you over the edge. I think that is really what's going to come down to in this game, and what Laurier is going to be focusing on in establishing the run, getting Tanner Nelms his touches, and then, of course, those receivers are going to do their thing. Even with Raiden Thorne, one of the OUA All-Stars, down in the Yates Cup, Ryan Hughes, second-year player, stepped up to be the leading receiver on that team. Even Laomi Ojotalayo, Ryan Spade, Jace Atkinson, these are receivers that could very easily be all-star receivers on other teams, and they all happen to be on one space with one of the nation's best quarterbacks. So while certainly going into this game, Bishops is going to be looking at that passing attack, I think the run game here is really what Laurie's looking to expand on and make sure that it's primed and ready to go for hopefully a national championship appearance.
Gord, if it's not a W, what does Bishops want to get out of this?
I mean, I think Bishops, especially on that side of the ball, wants to make the statement that, hey, they can hang with the absolute best. And I think I would say that it's safe to say at this point in time that this is the best offense in the country they're going to play. So for them, it's strength on strength. And what I think that they really want to make the statement of is that, hey, our strength, we may still have some building to do, especially on the other side of the ball, but our strength, the backbone of our program right now, is at the level or close to the level that it needs to be a serious contender outside of the conference. And I think that that's priority number one for them. Now, people like coaching staffs don't think that way. They're going into this going, okay, how are we going to pull this off? We want to win this game. So I don't want to take that possibility away from them outright. But I do think that in terms of the nature of the game itself, the number one statement I think they want to make, I think it's in particular on that side of the ball that, hey, we can hold anybody in the nation under control. We just have to figure out how to keep up on the other side.
Great. Guys, thanks very much for this. When we come back, we will have Pierre Trochet, the president of IFAF. Stick around. And welcome back to Gridiron Nation on TSN, everyone. It's now my pleasure to be joined by Pierre Trochet from Klagenfurt, Austria, correct? Is that because a couple days ago you were in Munich. You're originally from France. I got to get an air tag on you to track where you are these days.
Yeah, hi Jim. Good morning, good evening, everyone watching the show. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Now, Pierre's the president of IFAF, and IFAF's gone through an amazing transformation over the last couple of years as things gear up for the Olympic Games at LA 28. What sort of transformational processes had to go on at IFAF to prepare for piloting the Olympic Games for flag football?
Well, as the international governing body of American football and flag, IFAF get together 74 nations worldwide. We now address to about 20 million players in about 100 countries. So the transformation, just by the numbers, is absolutely fantastic. Coming from obviously one of the youngest IF of the Olympic movement, coming from a now fully recognized international federation, but also, as you just mentioned, a part of the Olympic. We're going to start our journey in LA 2028. And I insist on starting our journey. This is definitely not a one and done. But it's been a very fantastic 3 years from where we come from, getting unified. Obviously, last year we had our biggest continental iteration ever when it comes to flag football. We had competition in America, we had competition in Europe, we had competition in Asia, Oceania as well, and all of that get together at one of the biggest, or let's say the biggest World Championship we ever had in Finland just a couple of months ago. We were only in November. So we had 54 teams coming from 30 nations in Finland for the World Championship. This is the flag football visible part of it. And we also have tackle football activities. We had a great U20 World Championship back to you in Canada at that time. It was a fantastic time in Edmonton. We had a World Women's Championship as well, tackle football in 23 in Finland. We have regular continental activity in Europe, and we're building right now in America. So IFAF is managing all of that in terms of delivery, but mostly also in terms of governance, linked with the Olympic movement, the National Olympic Committees, anti-doping, rule of the game, training and education, safeguarding, and I can go on like this for a while. It's a busy job to be an international governing body.
Yeah, in some ways, it's almost been like speed dating for this organization. You got a very short time to put a whole lot of stuff together and get your message out. Do you find it energizing, exhausting, or both to be at the helm of an organization that needs to do so much in so short of time? When I was having discussions with folks in Football Canada, they say, well, the Olympics are 4 years away. No, the Olympics started yesterday for that organization. Yes. So I think people can only imagine the amount of work and alignment that needs to occur in the run-up to an Olympic Games for a relatively young international federation.
Yeah, as you just mentioned, I think the game started actually yesterday for 2028. We're just on the corner of Paris, which was a fantastic moment for the entire Olympic movement. And that's in terms of summer sports, as long as the previous edition is over, then the entire focus switch on LA. Like, we're going to start to have more regular conversation, coordination about our qualification pathway as well, which is now waiting to be known to get the best teams of the world to this Olympic competition. It's highly energizing. It presents some challenges, but we enjoy as a team altogether to turn that out as an opportunity, because now you can truly say, for obviously the last 5 or 6 years, like we are a truly global sports, and actually in a very humble way, one of the fastest growing sport worldwide. Like, now you have football in both forms: tackle, flag, tackle and flag, tackle or flag, whatever, in every continent, from South Africa up to Finland, from Canada to New Zealand. It's truly a fantastic moment and activity. So yes, there's a lot of things along the way, and there's a very long planning. As IFAF, we also try to update our process. Like, we just finished Finland 24. We already on the way to work on the World 2026 with an entire bidding process, and especially in flag, we play every year. So next year we're going to have another range of continental championship. We also prepare what will be an amazing World Games in Chengdu, China, for the top 8 women team that is coming early August, and then we do it all over again, and then up to the Olympics. When you look at tackle football, after this great competition we had in Edmonton, we're now looking at the next World Championship, and we're looking at continental activities. Europe just had at a game, for example, last week, Finland defeat France in the U19 qualifiers, looking now for the playoffs. The European senior just finished the first qualifying round. We're going to go to playoff and final as well for next summer. So there's always football to watch worldwide, and that's the fun out of it.
What does it mean to have a partner in alignment like the National Football League working with you on your Olympic goals? You were recently in Munich at the NFL International game. How does that literally put gas in your tank?
Well, in a very fun, in a very funny and highly interesting way. Like when you watch a little bit of sports, generally speaking, the major league worldwide are having a huge effort into growing fandom, and actually football present one of those real specificity, I would say, where you have one of the biggest, probably the biggest sports league in the world, working with the youngest international federation of the Olympic movement, that actually fandom and participation grow in tandem. And this is actually something that is not so common in other sports, besides obviously the transfer of knowledge in terms of broadcast, in terms of event presentation, in terms of aligning on the numbers of topics that comes from, superstar being presented at the game down to education. Like we are looking now, for example, at the common activities in March for coaching and referee education in Ghana, for example. So it's not just like fan oriented. It's a real tandem that grows together. Like we have common initiatives now in Australia with about I think about 50,000 kids just will start to play flag football in Australia recently. So there's a relationship between the NFL and the international federation, but there's also a relationship between regional office of the NFL and domestic federation. Like I believe Canada have been able to do something really groundbreaking in terms of participation. It's the case also, as you mentioned, it came back from Germany. They have flag in school over there that is delivered by the American Football Federation of Germany in partnership with the German office of the NFL. And I think next week, and yes, exactly, in about 2 weeks, we're going to have the same in France with the final of the U12 championship. Like it's, for example, an activity of flag football, especially for the young kid, young boy and young girls, that the federation didn't really have the resources, the manpower, coaches, men and women, referees, etc., to actually make it happen. The support of the NFL to bring this little bit of highlights of the sports, like all of a sudden gather the focus of the school ministry, gather the focus of local school or regional government, that all of a sudden support with the federation the creation of an entire new categories of players. And now you have an entire 5 or 6 leagues playing together for 3 months with the U12 and U14 boys and girls new flag program, leading to a national final. So it's not just the visible shiny part of it, as you just mentioned. International games are like the culmination of that, but there's initiatives all year long with the NFL on every continent.
We've had people on this show comment about flag football and its potential impact on tackle football. There are 2 camps, of course. There's one camp that sees it as a tremendous gateway for bringing people into the sport at a young age and then giving them the choice between the 2 disciplines or playing both disciplines. But there are some other individuals that think, hey, you know what, that's going to take energy away from tackle football. What do you say to them?
Well, I think we can do both. There's no limitation in that. Flag has some positive impact into discovering the game without having the investment. And I'm not just talking about the money. Again, I'm talking about the resources in terms of time, in terms of equipment. Like, have you tried to ship 40 or 60 shoulder pad, helmet, and 200 ball in Papua New Guinea, for example? It's beside the cost of the equipment, there's the cost of the transport. There's a lot of things that comes in place where flag has, potentially a faster, how do you say that in English, like groundbreaking method that is faster than tackle football. And in some place, obviously looking at America and the entire continent, not just talking about Canada or the US, but in Mexico, in Brazil, in Chile, in Panama, for example, like they have a structure and an history to play tackle football. And so sometimes you have, as you say, the same players. Sometimes this is just 2 different type of players. you can play flag football potentially 10 months a year, right? Playing tackle football, as we both know, can be more restrictive in terms of how many time you need to prepare to actually play the game. So there's a taste for everybody. It's not just specific tackle or flag. It's not one of them is elite or not elite, or this. It's a pathway for all. And my last point is also regarding the young girls that want to play football in some countries. Obviously, country in development, even though in Europe, I know in Canada you have a brilliant woman pathway for tackle football. But if you look at some other country, like for example, Italy or in Africa or Australia, like women tackle football is still a very developed program in development. And flag comes with an answer where you can play with smaller numbers of players, you can play more often, and you keep growing. And I think there's also a matter for the kids. When they watch football on TV and they want to be a great superstar and they see the clips on Instagram and all social media, well, little boy, little girl, grab your ball and go to your friend in the park and just throw the ball. And it's some form of football. Doesn't matter if it's flag or tackle.
Where does your enthusiasm for this sport come from? Like, what is your background in the sport for people that don't know? How did you end up becoming the lead of an international federation at the tender age of being under 40 in a world full of older suits, shall we say? How did you get here, Pierre?
It depends how long is your show, Jim. Then I can make a short story or a very long one, right? Yeah. No, it's just like, I mean, the short part is that I come from a city called Châteauroux in France, which was after World War II a NATO base, and actually the only one with a working landing track that was big enough for cargo aircraft and troops moving around from the US and all over Europe. And so this entire town, which is about 100,000 people right now, but was basically built around the army, and therefore the city kind of grew up in the 50s with a certain American lifestyle, like going to a burger joint, etc., etc. My parents, especially my father, come from that ground. Never played the ball, right? Never ever played football, but I've seen it as a kid. I've seen it hanging around with one of those buckle of the Kansas City Chiefs or high school rings, Champions high school ring, even though we never played. And I just get to grow up in that. And in 1992, my first love was basketball. So I wanted to watch the Dream Team and obviously Michael Jordan arriving in Barcelona, etc. And funny enough, I was obviously a big kid, played offensive lineman myself. My father was like, you should actually invest in football because by the time you grew up, you could be in the Olympics. And funny enough that now, back in 2024, when I talked to my father, I'm like, well, I'm working on it. Obviously, will not be a part of it as an athlete, but that's how it works. You get the love of the game, the passion of the game. I played myself, and then I always was lucky enough to be able to afford my study playing football, to travel the world playing football, to meet some important people in my life playing football, some friends and some family, some colleague that now becomes friends, etc. And 3 years ago, I took the opportunity to take the International Federation of International Football, put my candidacy forward as a president to lead this Olympic effort, and so far so good. I think we score a first touchdown, and I hope there's many more to come in the next 4 years, especially with the Olympic movement. Like LA is a start. I think it's the right place, the right moment, the right place to start. But we shared a strong commitment with the NFL to stay in the Olympic game. So whenever time will be appropriate, we will look toward Brisbane, definitely.
Well, you're up for president again at the upcoming IFAF Congress in December, uncontested. So I expect to see you there for another 4 years. And I
expect to see you too.
Yeah. Well, me too. I'm really looking forward to this upcoming Congress in Switzerland in December, so we can collectively move forward over these next 4 years and make football and the Olympics a reality. Pierre, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everybody. And as you said, Lausanne will be the first one in the Olympic Museum, so it's going to be a milestone moment for IFAF and our entire community. It's going to be definitely very important. I'm looking forward as well. Thank you for having me.
when we come back. Games of the week. And welcome back to Gridiron Nation on TSN. Time for NCAA Games of the Week. There are a number of teams just on that cusp of getting into bowl games. Tell us about a group of three, Gord.
Yeah, that's right. We're a couple weeks left in the season, so we're starting to get down to crunch time for most of these teams, and it's the teams in that 4 to 5 win mark that have a lot on the line in this next couple of weeks. And a few teams have fallen to that are teams we've been following all year long in North Texas, in Rutgers, in Hawaii. And I know these maybe aren't the sexiest names to follow in this show right now, but let's start with North Texas. Jalen Smith, another really good performance for him. And what I really liked, I alluded to this on last week's show, but he stood out in different ways than he has historically stood out for this defense against a very run-heavy Army attack. Ultimately, they fell a little short. Army puts this game away with almost a quarter in length drive, touchdown drive in the third to put this away. But Smith was excellent again for them. They get UTSA this week. They are favored by 2 to 3 points of the different places I've seen so far. And they need to win this game to get to bowl eligibility. They're in a pretty good spot to do so. Jump over to Hawaii. Nick Senecal, again, some explosive plays from him. 2 catches for 70 yards. One of those was, I think, a 62-yard bomb. And so didn't get the volume he's been getting for the couple weeks before that, but contributed significantly in what was a gutsy effort for Hawaii, holding UNLV very tight. Unfortunately, they come up short, and that leaves them at 4-5, needing to win 2 of their last 3 to get to bowl eligibility. This week, they go into Utah State to play against them in Ogden, and they are a couple point favorite in this game too. So this is a game that they absolutely need to have if they're going to get to bowl eligibility. And then finally, Rutgers, they get off the schneid. They hit the skids a little bit, a 3-game losing streak going into last week's game against Minnesota. They turned the ship around with a very impressive win against a favored Minnesota squad at home. And Dario Jabome was all over the map. 13 tackles, 3 tackles for a loss, a sack. He was everywhere and continues to be the real breakout star of our Canadian guys this year. And Rutgers is now in a position where they have a realistic shot at the bowl game at 5-4. So they need to win 1 more here, and they are in a good place to potentially do that, playing against a Maryland team that is not expected to blow them out of the water. I'm looking at a 3 to 4 point line in this one. It's going to be tough to go on the road and get that done, but hopefully they can build off some of the momentum from this last week's effort, particularly Ethan Kelly-McManus, their quarterback, had an excellent game for them on the other side of the ball. If he can keep that momentum going, they're in good shape.
Thanks for that, Gord. So for everyone on Gridiron Nation, this is Jim Mullin saying, let's get out to the game.